Hey, hey, hey. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Oh, boy, we've got a lot to talk about tonight. I know I'm coming to you at a pretty odd time, but I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're joining in. So come on in, come on in. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Come on in, come on in. Let's talk about the RFK, MLK, JFK files.
Yes.
Why is it so important
There's
that they're
so
being
much of a
released? Look,
yeah,
I
there's
mean,
so
and why are they and why has it been so important to hold on to them? We've got Lisa Pease. Indeed, she's probably the preeminent researcher in the RFK space. That assassination, which has really made her an expert on the JFK assassination. Yes, I do say that, and MLK, because they seem to be connected. We lost so many iconic leaders in the United States and around the world. And there at that time, in that particular time period, and it seems like those those murders have a common tie.
they
And we
sure
need to
do.
talk about that. And Lisa Pease, I'm just so glad that you're there. I want everyone to get your book, A Lie Too Big to Fail: The Real History of the Assassination of Robert Kennedy. It's important for us to really to understand that, everybody, because I have to tell you, Lisa Pease, I've got a vested interest in this. My parents, worked for Dr. King. Everybody says, I marched with him and that was important. But Dr. King's work, marches didn't occur every day. It was the organizing, it was the strategizing, the everyday work. It was going on the road, trying to raise money to pay a staff. Not much, but trying to do that. My parents worked for him, and so many of their friends were killed. So
Hmm.
many. And I grew up in that, as their eldest child, I grew up in that environment. I met Fred Hampton.
Hmm.
And so to get up in the morning when I'm on my way to first grade, to look at the TV as I'm waiting for someone to drive me to school, trying to decipher, knowing that wasn't he just at the meeting last week?
Wow.
Knowing that he'd been killed. So I've had more than a passing interest in assassinations because, my father's been the target of them,
Hmm.
the plots. And I understand Robert Kennedy Jr. Many people find him to be a bit of an odd person. He has not had experiences, everybody, that most people in the world have had. He has stepped through the looking glass. How many of us can imagine playing touch football with our family and having our father get an urgent call, watching his disposition change, and you follow him? 'Cause we've done that with our father too. And you said, okay, well, Daddy, what, not to ask Daddy what's going on. Something has happened and it's awful. And his brother, his beloved brother, had been killed. And he picks up the phone and calls the CIA and the FBI and asks him, did you do it? Did you do this? Or do you know who did? What happened? Because he was the Attorney General of the United States. He knew something happened and he understood the security protocols, and he knew enough to know that it was not a straight line, that there was some kind of security breach. That's the way that it goes, everybody. So we got to talk about this. That's why I'm bringing you on, Lisa Pease, because so much is happening. I'm going to have Jefferson Morley on in a couple of days. And I want to bring this up because we are living in times that are tumultuous.
Hmm.
Whatever you think about Donald Trump, there were two assassination attempts on his life. You ought to want to know what happened. This has nothing to do with you liking someone or not. You need to know, we all need to
Yeah.
know what happened. No one needs to step into this space and lose their lives or have it taken from them. So, Lisa Pease, let me start with you. And
Great.
I want to give you the runway to talk about this because your work has been so brilliant, and it's really, you've been so dedicated to this. Um, Judge Judge Napolitano asked Donald Trump in the closing days of his presidency, he said, he said from time to time he would call me and ask, he would want to get my feedback. And George Napolitano was a brilliant guy, and a man of real, of principle based opinions. I got to know him at Fox, like him a lot. And he said, my disappointment is that why didn't you release the JFK files? Why? And he said, Donald Trump said to me,
if you saw what was in those files, you wouldn't release them either. That's what he said.
And he said,
Which
one
is
day,
interesting.
if I don't have 15, 30 people listening to me on the phone,
right?
I can tell you.
Tell you.
So you talk to me. Why don't we start there? Because that's current. And that was when he was leaving his first presidency, I guess in 2020. And now 4 years later, he's back.
Yeah, well, I think the CIA has something else in store for him, because even though he has replaced the head of the CIA and the head of the National Intelligence, the way intelligence agencies work, the information is at the lower rungs. It doesn't always bubble up to the top. And it's not like there's just a little drawer with the JFK files that are withheld in them. It's a very complicated database that they've set up, and I think complicated on purpose. So I don't think it's going to be easy as like flipping a switch and releasing the files. I'll be super happy if that's the case. But I think the CIA will do what they have always done: stall, delay, come up with excuses, sit people down in the office with them and say, we can't release this file because it shows our sources and methods or whatever. But there are known records that we all want. For example, Bill Harvey was the head of kind of the Cuban task force that was trying to kill Castro and overthrow Castro. And he went to Italy. He really pissed off Robert Kennedy because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bill Harvey was sending 10 commando teams into Cuba to take out Castro. And as soon as RFK heard about this, he was livid, and he demanded that Harvey come into the room with him, and he read him the riot act. What do you think you're doing? How dare you? And then Harvey's like, I'm not doing anything the Pentagon didn't tell me to do. And Bobby's like, no, I already talked to the Pentagon. They said this is you. And so he basically asked the CIA to fire Harvey. Well, they didn't fire Harvey. They sent him off to Rome. And guess who's in Rome? Of course, Corsican Mafia, and maybe some of the people who might have been the shooters in Dealey Plaza. And there is an account, and I think it's in I think David Talbot has a good account of this in his book, but it's in a few books. That Bill Harvey supposedly was seen in Dealey Plaza, and that somebody else saw him on the plane on his way to Dealey Plaza. Well, the CIA has never released Bill Harvey's travel records. So that's something we know they have that they won't release, which could tell us something really important, because he's pretty high up in the CIA. And if he's in Dallas when the shoot is going down after essentially being fired by the Kennedys and sent to Rome to hide him, what's going on, right? That's highly suggestive. So that's a very important set of records. I know you mentioned you'll have Jeff Morley on, and he'll be talking about George Joannidis, who was during the House Select Committee on Investigations, which is frankly the closest we ever got to really unraveling the plot. All right, in 1977, Congress passed, this great law and created a body and gave it at the time kind of an unlimited time frame that kept shrinking, of course, down to, basically 2 years. But in those 2 years, they hired a lot of actual lawyers as investigators. They brought in some young kids, hot, smart kids from law schools, and turned them loose on the CIA's records. Dan Hardway, who I've met many times, or a few times, and talked to many times, was one of these guys. And he got in deep in the CIA records. And he's like, as soon as we got onto, the path of kind of the higher ups who might have been involved, That's when this guy, George Joanides, was brought in back from retirement and shut off their access. Now, what they didn't know at the time was that George Joanides was in charge of a group, the DRE, the Directorate Revolutionary. I'm totally saying this wrong, but it was a Cuban, anti Castro Cuban group that was not just in Florida, it was also in New Orleans. And when Oswald got involved with Carlos Brunier, um, who was an anti-Castro activist, and they had a famous, fight in the street, and it made the news and was reported on immediately after the assassination that, this commie Oswald was fighting this anti-Castro Carlos Brunier. Well, Brunier would have been working for George Joanides. George Joanides was literally responsible for the people that Oswald was interacting with in the moments leading up to the assassination. So it would have been really important for the House Select Committee on Assassinations to know that they might have brought in one of the guys involved in the plot to cover up, because frankly, the CIA would need somebody who knew what had happened and who knew what had been involved, so he would know which records to cover up. Because not everybody at the CIA knows. Most people at the CIA honestly don't know and don't believe that, the CIA killed Castro, because that's what they're always told. But, behind me on these shelves, I have a book by the CIA's historian on Guatemala. And in his preface, he basically says, it was so hard to write this book because even though the CIA gave me access to all their files, it was clear from the files that everybody was lying to everybody else. And so trying to pick out what was actually happening or what was the truth was very difficult. And in the end, he kind of threw up his hands and said, look, I did the best I could with the records I had. But I can't say for sure this is the definitive account. And the CIA does that on purpose. It's called compartmentalization. They tell people only the tiny bit that they need to know to complete their job. Somebody is told, take a rifle to this building, or, put this in the mail, or take Oswald out, for a car ride today, whatever, take him to a car dealership and have him put on an act there. But no one knows why all that's happening. Only a few guys at the very top know. And one of the things that the Church Committee, which was the predecessor Senate Select Committee to study government and intelligence operations, basically, more commonly known as the Church Committee, they also investigated the Kennedy assassination, and in the process, they found Bill Harvey's notes on assassination plotting. They called it executive action. And one of the first notes was nothing on paper. So that's why I am probably one of the least excited, unbelievably, right, with my serious interest in the files. But I don't think we're ever going to find, like, here's the receipt that where Alan Dulles paid the shooter to show up in Dealey Plaza. I don't think we're going to find anything like that. I don't think we're going to find any kind of signed confession or direct order. It would all be very shaded, hush hush, hinted at. And I did find something interesting in that that's already been released. In 1967, which is a few years after, because the assassination happened in 1963, Mark Lane was doing some talking about the case, but it hadn't, I'm sorry, it was 65 is this file that I'm thinking about, because in 67, the Zapruder frames were posted in Life magazine on the cover, and that spurred a lot of interest in conspiracy. But in 65, there wasn't a lot of talk or knowledge about conspiracy. There was no internet. The media definitely wasn't covering a conspiracy angle. It was all completely Oswald did it alone. And in 65, the CIA notes that a Mexican consulate operator is coming through DC. And this guy was important. His name was Eusebio Askew. And the reason he was important is because he's one of the few people who said, well, the Oswald that I met at the Cuban embassy was not the guy that I saw on TV that was killed in Dallas. That's not the guy that I saw. He said the guy I saw was short and blonde and didn't look anything like that. So the CIA now, they hear that he's coming to DC and they're like, see if you can take him out and get him drunk and get him to talk about Oswald. And I think what they really meant, that's what they're saying overtly, basically. And I think what they really meant is see if you can get him to change his story. about what he saw and see if you can get him to say it was Oswald. Maybe under the influence of alcohol, they might get a statement out of him that they could then slip into the files. So there are hints that the CIA knows they have things to cover up and is quietly going about covering them up even before the Zapruder film is ever seen by the public in any way.
But let me ask you this, Lisa Pease. We're talking with Lisa Pease, preeminent researcher. You've got to get her book, A Lie Too Big to Fail. It's the real history of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. It's important for us to know this. Why?
Because it's our history is like our medical chart. And you want to know if you have a history of, let's say, cancer in the family or diabetes. You need to know what medicines you should be taking to cure what ails you. And if we have a false history, we're going to create false cures for it. You know, if we think the problem is just Democrats and they're all terrible, and if we replace them with these Republicans, life will be so much better. That's a cure that's not going to work because that wasn't the real problem. You see what I'm saying? So
Because let
history
me ask you
actually
this,
matters. Mhm.
because these agencies are apolitical, if you will. I mean, they're not apartisan. They're not. They have
They're
their
not supposed to be partisan, but
what?
they are
Yeah,
deeply fascist, if you will.
well,
Both the FBI
which
and the CIA.
which
Yeah.
is we see fascists in both parties, if you will.
Yes, that's
You
true.
know,
That's true. Mhm.
unfortunately, I mean, but it's just fascism is an ism, and
Yes.
and then you
But
have
it's a very controlling point of view, and
yeah,
it's also a we know better, the public should not be involved. It's a very anti-democratic
yeah.
point of view. And I think it really matters because how do we know if the media is credible? How do I know if I can believe what I
Mhm.
read in the New York Times? Because now and then I can verify what they report in the New York Times. You know, I saw that baseball game, and yes, that was the correct score. There are things we can easily, readily verify. When it comes to the JFK case, it's not so easy to readily verify, but it is easy to find the flaws in their reporting. So we may not know what happened, but a lot of us know what didn't happen. And when we see them reporting over and over, lone nut, and we know that there's no way Oswald could have, shot Kennedy and shot all of the people, that were in all of the bullets and in the time frame from that location where he couldn't have been. There was no nitrate on his cheek, even though when the FBI fired his very same rifle, their agent couldn't not get, you know, uh, nitrate on the
Residue
cheek.
from the
Yeah,
bullet.
exactly. And they tried to say, well, the rifle barrel was so sealed, that's why Oswald didn't get him. Like, well, then how come the FBI guy got all that powder on him? So we know when they're lying. We can't always say what the truth is, but we know what the truth isn't. And I think a lot of the problems we're having today, I think the reason Trump came to power in the first place is he was one of the first to really boldly call out, what he called fake news.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't call it fake news, but I would call it inaccurate news. There
Mhm.
has been a significant amount of inaccurate news that has led to an erosion of our faith in government. And so, if by releasing these files, if we somehow magically finally get the truth of who really killed Kennedy, that would be a step forward. Now, here's the other thing, even if us researchers get it and recognize the truth, will the media report it? Or is the media still answering to other powers that don't want us to know? Carl Bernstein in 1977 in Rolling Stone wrote an amazing article called The CIA and the Media. And it's still available on his website, carlbernstein.com. Go to magazine articles, and it's the first one listed. It was a 16-page article. He talked about how ABC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, AP, Reuters, every single major media organization was to some degree infiltrated and controlled by the CIA. Sometimes these were paid arrangements, many more times they were volunteer arrangements. The owners, loved it because the CIA's, look, we'll give you some access to some really inside stories, but you have to work with us on things that we don't want to say. And I believe strongly that that's why we have not gotten the truth about the JFK assassination or the Robert Kennedy assassination or the Martin Luther King assassination, because that nexus of the media and the intelligence agencies is a very dangerous one. And I don't know if they still do this, but they used to have an annual dinner with the media. Well, this was with CBS, but specifically,
I
yes. Go
go.
ahead.
It's the
Yeah.
correspondence dinner. I mean, and it's
Yes.
when you get
And
there,
they would sit them spook journalists, so that on their right and their left, they had
can,
a
can you
somebody feeding them
can
disinformation.
you distinguish the well, I mean, I'm just calling it, to me, it's the correspondence dinner because I'm like, this something about this always felt odd to me. It feels odd because I'm like, wait a minute. If if these people are supposed to be reporting on the news,
Right.
you can't be you can't befriend the newsmakers. Although
Exactly.
that's what they do. I mean, it's just
But
uh
it's
I,
so incestuous. I mean, they
yeah.
all go to each other's Georgetown parties. The journalists and the politicians sit there and they schmooze, and no one wants to lose access. And we see now Trump is kind of the extreme of that. The AP refused to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and they are now banned from all White House events. So I wonder how long that stance will last. I would like it to last long enough for the Gulf not to be renamed. I don't think we fought an American Revolution to oppose kings, people that were above the law. We didn't want to live under a dictatorship by one man. That is the entire reason for the American Revolution.
Mhm.
And now here we've kind of voted in a guy who wants to be king, who wants to make all the rules himself. And that's very dangerous for this country. So,
But
um,
Lisa, I feel like we've been on a downward spiral. I mean, you had 14 million Democrats who voted in the primary
mm,
for one guy, whether they wanted him or not, and many people felt very uncomfortable with then President Biden. And
yes,
yet all those votes were tossed out.
yes.
So when we talk
Well,
about imperializing an office,
mhm.
imperializing imperializing power, we've already done that. And we saw the
Yeah.
Democrats do this. We've seen
Yeah, the Democrats
everybody,
stopped holding primaries, basically. They
they
just ignored
announced
the results
no,
of 2016 when Bernie was leading, and again in 2020, they basically forced all the other candidates
they
to
took
drop
them out.
out to endorse Biden to keep Bernie from winning. There has been nothing democratic about the Democratic Party for
Yeah.
many years now. And then they wonder why they lose elections. Hello. And of course, I've been a lifelong Democrat, but having a Democratic president supporting genocide in Gaza to me was beyond the pale, and just shocked me to the very core of my being.
Mhm.
And I know that a
Mhm.
lot of people did not vote for Biden because of that.
Mhm.
I don't know if they voted for Trump or, voted third party or what they did. I also do know that Trump posted on Twitter, or X, I guess it's called. He thanked Elon Musk publicly. He said it's a really good thing that Elon Musk really understood those Pennsylvania voting machines. Thank you, Elon. And if that doesn't sound like thank you for stealing the election, I don't know what does.
Uh,
So it's hard to know because we don't have a transparent vote. We really have two choices. We can either have a completely secret vote, or we can have a non-secret vote and know exactly how people are voting. But we can't seem to find a way to have both. And maybe we need to go back to hand counting every single
I
paper
think we
ballot.
I think
Yeah.
we should. There's too much space for graft with the computer. I
Yes,
don't
there is.
I don't trust that process at all. And I don't think
Yeah.
anyone should. I
I
think that you can
I
cast.
wrote a document for Howard Dean back in 2004 when he was
Mhm.
running for president, and he read it, and it listed all the like races that had been reversed on computer error, which I think in most cases were deliberate errors. But it's provable that there have been wrong elections based on electronic voting.
But
And
Lisa,
now,
we
like,
used to
even in yeah, go ahead.
no no no. I was just going to say
Oh,
we used to trust, and they were accurate exit polls. But when the exit
Yes.
polls started differing, wildly diverging from the
Hmm.
computer generated results, they said we don't trust exit polls. I said, why not? They
Yeah,
have been
they always worked
accurate.
before. And statistics is a very scientific method, and it doesn't take a
Mm,
huge poll. They liken it to soup. If you're making like cream of tomato soup
mm,
and you dip a spoon in anywhere, you might get a slightly different mixture of tomato and cream. But if you dip your spoon in about 10 times in a big pot, you've pretty much tasted all the flavors in that
yeah.
soup. And similarly, in statistics, you don't have to like drink the whole pot of soup to know that it's tomato cream soup.
Let me ask you this, because I want to drill down on why it's so important for us
Yes.
to know, for these files to be released. I think that, as President Trump said, this is big, and I said I don't care what comes out.
Yeah, yeah.
I,
Well, I also think if he knows that the CIA killed Kennedy, and right now
hmm
he's kind of having his own war with the CIA,
hmm
it may serve his interests to expose the CIA as being behind the assassination,
hmm
because then there will be a public outcry to destroy the CIA. And the CIA, sadly, might be the only check on Trump right now, keeping him from being a dictator. So we're in this horrible bind because I definitely want
no,
the files. I want to know the truth, but
and
I
I can
don't
take
want
care
it
of
at the
him.
expense of all our security either.
I can take care of him, but their behavior has been so, they have destroyed the trust,
Hmm.
and they've made me very uncomfortable. And if they made John F. Kennedy uncomfortable, and he said what he saw, because he saw
Oh
things I
yeah.
can't imagine, and he said they've got to be destroyed, then
Yes.
I just have an issue with that. Do
Yes.
we need security? Absolutely, but that's not what they're doing. They've become
No,
they've become a
and
police force.
Truman, who signed the CIA into existence essentially back in 1947 with the National Security Act, he wrote a month after JFK was killed, he wrote a letter to, that was published in the papers saying the CIA is not operating the way I intended them. I wanted
Mhm.
them to be an intelligence gathering operation, but they are really a covert operations organization. They're like a paramilitary organization. And the CIA controls a lot of the Pentagon, which I don't think a lot of people understand because the Pentagon is older and bigger. But the people at the Pentagon see the CIA as like the elite of the elite, and they all want to be a part of that. I found letters in Alan Dulles' files, admirals saying, to Alan Dulles, if you ever need anything from the Navy, come to me and I will help you, because they want to be on that inner circle. The CIA set themselves up as like, the magic, inner circle, and so people really wanted in, and they weren't likely to betray the secrets because then they'd be on the outside again. So I don't think people, even some of the other researchers, don't seem to understand that dynamic, that even though they're small, they had the cachet.
Well, they come out of Yale. I mean,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and it's a family, because from
Hmm.
generation to generation, it's almost, you have to be onboarded in. I think through your dad,
Yeah.
through your mom.
That
I mean,
helps.
that's Oh, God bless you. And would you like to get some water?
I
Oh,
think I'm okay.
oh,
I'll
okay.
We'll see if I keep coughing, and then
Oh,
I'll.
okay. But so I mean, so my question then becomes, okay, they're protecting themselves, which power always does, and people protect them.
Mhm.
I mean, let's, if you want to make it personal, that's what we do.
Right?
What? Why is even the why is it important for a president of the United States? Just put Trump aside.
Mhm.
Why is it important for a president of the United States, who is really an iconoclast? Trump is hard to pin down because really, he's not really a Republican. He's been more of a Democrat. I mean, all these, but he was going to run
Mhm.
on, he was toying with the idea of running for president in 2000 on the Ross Perot ticket.
Mhm.
He's someone who's not, you can't
He's
peg
not
him.
ideological. He's not.
No, he's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
And so, and so I, and he is also seen and he knows a lot. When you get into that
Mhm.
space, you don't see, you step through the looking glass. You don't see things the way people see things. Like you, given
Well,
your,
he's also so rich that he doesn't rely on his donors. He's got a few rich friends who feel the way he does, and he doesn't need the money that most presidential candidates need.
he's in a completely different space. But
Mhm.
you're in a completely different space because you've gone deep, deep, deep into the rabbit hole, and
Yeah.
you have seen things that you tell people you, because you, when you've been on my show, when I've talked to you, you said, "Wait a minute, what's black is white, what's white is black." That's what we saw in JFK.
Right,
Some
right.
people, you got to think how these people think. So my question for
Mhm.
you is, why is it important for a president to say, "I want to release the files on these three assassinations of these three iconic figures," because they really were really the icons of that age, and they
Well, I
become
do.
for all time.
y-
Really?
Yeah. I think one, he doesn't think it will be the end of his presidency if he releases those files. I think that's one. Two, a lot of time has gone by. All those people are dead. It's not like he's injuring somebody who's still alive. All the assassins, I'm sure, have long ago passed away. Um, but three, I also think Trump is doing this as a PR ploy. It's
Mm,
very popular with his base. Remember, these were the people who gathered on the grassy knoll expecting John Jr. to appear on the anniversary of the assassination. That's
really?
Trump's base. Yes, this actually happened. On the 60th anniversary, a contingent of MAGA was out there on the grassy knoll looking for John Jr., who they say never really died, that he's just been in hiding, waiting to come out, and they thought he would be the vice president of Trump. So Trump is catering to that crowd by saying he's releasing all the files. So now we find out, does Trump mean it or not? And we'll know in maybe another 30 days, because the first wave of this was 15 days to come up with a plan and 45 days to release the files. I don't think that's possible, but I'll
Mhm.
be very curious to hear what they say at the 15-day mark, which frankly I think we've already just passed,
Mhm.
and then the 45-day mark. So because this is a brilliant, if I were his strategist, I'd say, yeah, give them this. This will distract the masses. They'll be so happy that you're giving them their real history that they won't notice that you're, tearing down the government from within through Doge. It's like,
Almost 2.3 million people have gotten pink slips, and
yeah,
more and more getting
yeah.
them every
And of
day.
course, what does unemployment do? It causes more inflation, right? I mean,
But
there's,
I get the sense that there's something else going on with the economy too, because we do have an unsustainable debt, and I've never seen this many publicly extremely wealthy people on the front row at an inauguration in my life. They're
Mhm.
never that forward. They,
Right.
they don't, that's not what they do. You have, if you pan over the inaugurations now, you have some well-known people, but if you will, who are in the stands and who are waiting, and you go back to the Oval, and you talk, and then you go, yeah, but you have a little reception. I get it, been there, done that, got it. And I only share that with you all because I want you to know how this really, really works, which is what Lisa Peace's work has been about, helping us to see how this really works. To see all of these people on the front row, I said, something is out of
It's
sync.
takeover by billionaires. I feel like we've
Mm.
literally, it's like we're returning to feudalism. There is a whole faction in this country that has tried to destroy our government since 1935,
But
or
wait a minute, Lisa,
I think
go
that
back.
was the year. Yeah, I want to talk about 1935 for a second,
Okay,
because this was when
please.
FDR had just been elected. I think he was, I want to say
633, but
32 or
he
something.
was very
Yeah,
early in
yeah.
the
Yeah,
presidency.
33 was his first year. By 35, they were already trying to create, and by they, I mean the DuPonts, some other very rich, wealthy families were trying to create a new chancellor position that would have almost equal authority to the president. They were trying to minimize the role of president and make him a figurehead and set up a chancellor, just like they had done in Germany, because Hitler was the chancellor, not the president, or the king or anything. And then they wanted to install, kind of an American Hitler. And they approached this guy, a Marine general or a Major General of the Marines, Smedley Butler. And
Yes.
he realized right away these guys are pretty serious about this, and this would destroy American democracy. So he's like, I'm going to play along with them and see if I can unravel their plot. And so for a year, he kind of led them on. Yes, I'll lead your troops. Oh, we're just not quite ready yet. Yes. And then when he got enough information, he went to Congress to expose this. And Congress was terrified because these were their donors. These were the people they didn't want to go up against. And so the whole affair was kind of shushed up. It was only barely reported in the media. And it wasn't until many years later that a writer, Jules Archer, went and really dug into the remaining documents, what little there was, and wrote this amazing book, The Plot to Seize the White House. So we had a strongly I would call it fascist, but it's more than that. It's like, well, oligarchic is really, I suppose, the best word. And I would call it feudalism because
Yeah.
the days of feudalism, the property owners went to the king and basically told the king, you're asking too much of us in taxes, and we're just going to start refusing to pay. And by joining together, they were kind of able to defeat the power of the king, and the king ended up having to give in to the landowners. And that's how. So even though there was a king, it was the really rich who controlled what happened in that country, at least as it affected them and their immediate lives. And so there's always been this kind of strain in America of
Yes.
people who never wanted democracy in the first place.
Since the beginning, because there was a fight. Number one, George Washington said, "Don't make me the king." That is not what they
Right.
wrote. And there was still a group of Americans. I mean, Benjamin Franklin's son, for heaven's sake, who was the governor of New Jersey, he was a
Yeah.
royalist. And
Yes.
it
Yes.
destroyed, it broke the relationship between him and his father. I mean, and
Yes.
that to me, there's a real strain of that. That's
And
very much a
Trump's
part of
own
our history.
family comes from kind of a Nazi line, that were Nazi supporters. And their original name was Drumpf. It wasn't even Trump,
Wait,
came
I
to
have
America,
something.
changed their name. Yeah.
No, I have something for you. The
Yeah.
governor of Georgia,
Uh-huh.
Governor Kemp. Did you know that Georgia originally was not a slave holding state? I did
I
not know
did
that.
not know
I
that.
found that out from Greg Palast's movie Vigilantes Inc.
Wow.
But do you know who introduced slavery into Georgia? Governor Kemp's family.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. That's
Oh, I
horrible.
mean, no, I'm just saying,
It's
'cause
horrible.
I appreciate Nazism,
Yeah.
but the Nazis learned from us. The Afrikaners learned from the United States.
Well, and the
We all,
UK, which was importing slaves too. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, and so I'm just
Yeah.
saying, but to perfect, because the UK never had as many black people and people of color. So
No, we really
understanding
did the
Jim
worst on that.
Crow and apartheid, that is based upon what we did here.
Yes.
And and I'm
Yeah,
just
remember the 3/5 voting, a black person their vote would only count for 3/5. It's just from the start, they never wanted a real democracy. In fact, we didn't even elect senators directly in the start.
that's right.
Originally, the Congress people elected the senators from their own, knowledge and connections and whatever.
Well,
And
they
that
kind of
was not.
still sort of have that, because
Yeah,
if
well,
something
and the
happens
fact
to a
we have
senator,
I have 2 senators, but only 1 congressperson, and the congressperson is the one who is closest to me. He's in my district, the area is not that big that he covers, but I don't need 2 senators. The reason that was set up was to give business people to make it easier for them to control the government, and again, by giving every state 2 senators, they could control South Dakota and North Dakota and Idaho and tiny states where no one cared, and then they could have their majority, at the stop. So our whole system is bent on allowing rich people to run our country to the detriment of the general public.
Is that what happened with these assassinations? I mean, because I
Yes
realize that
and
these
no. It's a little less direct than that
okay.
because how do the people get rich? Well, they get rich by ripping off other countries, by going to war in Congo to steal rare earth minerals so that they can make their technology and their airplanes that they can't make without those materials. And so they need to be able to overthrow the African leaders who are saying, you can't have those goods. Kennedy is saying, no, we have no right to go into these third world countries and steal their resources and overthrow their leaders. We have no right. And so Kennedy had to be moved out of the way. He had to be not only killed, but killed and discredited so no one like him could rise again. And because there was this whole chain behind him of good people, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, who shared that view that we need to play fair with the world, they
Mhm.
all had to be removed. And now you have a Democratic Party that is, like I said, endorsing genocide to support an ally.
But
And
and
that would
running
never
with
have
Liz
happened under
Cheney,
Kennedy. That would never
Lisa,
have happened. Yeah.
Lisa running with Liz Cheney. But
Yeah.
how
How did they think that was going to be a winning
I do
strategy?
not know. She voted
You
with
know?
Trump 89+% of the time. I'm like,
Yeah.
so I mean,
Yeah.
her beef with Trump is personal because Trump
Yeah.
took her father and all of these establishment Republicans out. That's all it
Yeah.
is. Don't
Yeah.
involve me in your personal fight. I've got bigger fish to fry. You always trying
Yeah.
to eliminate the Department of Education. What's going to happen to our children?
Yeah,
I
which
mean,
makes me
really.
wonder who is advising the Democratic Party because, again, it's the rich people who want to control things
The
on both
oligarch.
sides, in the oligarchs in the Republican Party and the oligarchs in the Democratic Party, and the people have no voice. And so, predictably, they turn to the first guy who said a lot of populist things. Now, he didn't do a lot of populist things in his first term, but he said all the right things. The media is fake. You're not being told the truth about the Kennedy assassination. Trump has said all the right things. It's just, like I said, what he does is often at variance with what he says, and that's the problem.
Well, I mean, but all these guys,
Yeah.
they're at variance with the truth. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, so you got to help me to understand when I look at what you, as I've listened to you down through the years, and I follow you very, very closely.
Thank you.
Oh no, no, thank you because
Oh,
well, no, because you've done because I'm really
a
keen.
lot of work.
Well, a lot of work, excellent research, and you've always dug down. And I
Mhm.
think that with JFK and MLK, um, somehow Robert Kennedy almost kind of got lost in the sauce. Almost.
Right. I
Kind of
think
sort
people
of.
had kind of conspiracy fatigue even among the
Okay.
research community, and they were tired of being called conspiracy theorists. So when the RFK case came along and there was Sirhan standing, visibly shooting a gun and firing at Kennedy, and then Kennedy falling down and dying, it was super easy to draw the conclusion that one must have killed the other.
But Lisa, but for this.
Mhm.
He was standing in front of Kennedy,
Right.
and Kennedy was killed where? He killed
Behind the right ear, not more than an inch and a half. So there's literally no way. Sirhan's gun muzzle was placed 3 feet in front of Kennedy by the only people who saw them both at the moment of the shooting. Some people did report a gun closer to Kennedy, and clearly there was a gun closer to Kennedy, but it wasn't tied to Sirhan. And that's the problem. And when you ask why were they killed, of course, it's not just money, it is war, it's power. Because here's the other thing, once you allow this is why I agree, by the way, with Bernie when he said billionaires should not exist, because once you have enough money to do anything you want any day of the week, eat all the food you want. I mean, how much food can you eat in a day? I mean, you can only eat so much, right?
Oh,
You
you
know,
sound
you
like my
can only
dad right
drive so many cars, you can only have so many refrigerators and so many homes before you're bored of it. So once you have the money to meet all your desires, what do you want next? You
now.
want power. You want to start to shape the world in the way that you see fit. And the problem is that most of the people who get that incredibly wealthy do it by ripping off the people on the way up. I mean, think about it. If Jeff Bezos paid all the people who actually do the work of stocking the warehouses, if he paid them all a lot of money, he could not possibly be as wealthy as he is. But he pays minimum wage for very difficult jobs, heavy labor, heavy lifting all day long, bad conditions, and then he takes the profit. So, I don't think there's a good example of somebody who got legitimately rich by paying everybody well. I just don't see that happening. And even if they did, why didn't they share the profits then? And there are, by the way, some CEOs who do that. There are companies
Yes.
and organizations that have profit sharing where a rising tide really does lift all boats. And in Japan, they used to have a model where the top person in a company, the CEO, could not make more than 10 times the lowest paid person in a company. And what a great rule that was, because then every time the CEO is going up in pay, everybody else is too. So again, a rising tide is lifting all boats. I don't mind there being a gap. I don't want everybody paid the same. I'm not a communist or something, but I think the disparity we have now is just beyond the pale. We shouldn't have billionaires like Elon Musk, because the other thing is, when they get that rich, they think they're that smart and they make
Yeah.
decisions that they have no idea about.
But
They don't know how Social Security works. They don't know, how the Kennedy Library is funded by foundations. I don't know if you saw, they literally shut down the Kennedy Library today and put a
no,
note on the door saying closed by executive order. Well, of course, the National Archives and the Kennedy Foundation, which pays for most of the library, said, no, we're going to reopen tomorrow. You don't get to shut us down. But they think they know better just because they are wealthy, and people don't say no to them because they are so
but
powerful.
Lisa, they're wealthy off of our money,
Our labor,
our
our brain
labor,
power.
and our government contracts.
Yes,
I
yes.
mean, so I'm like, wait a minute. And when you dig into their backgrounds, these are not people who are disconnected. I mean,
No.
for all of uh, the controversy around Robert Kennedy, he's not qualified. Now, he was one of the top environmental lawyers in the world, who was
Yeah.
lauded for that, and someone who, in order to study environmental racism and uh, all of these assaults upon our environment, he has to have more than a passing understanding of of science. We, I'm supposed to trust Bill Gates. Bill
Yeah. Yeah.
Gates really, I mean, he's
Again,
a
there's somebody
wealthy
who's so rich,
scientist.
thinks he knows
But
better than everybody
yeah,
else.
he hasn't invented anything. What he
Yeah.
does is take patents.
Well,
He
that's
owns,
Elon Musk too. Elon Musk
yeah.
bought Tesla. He didn't create Tesla, he bought it, you know?
I mean, that's why I'm saying. I'm
Yeah,
like, wait a minute. All this, everything is has been perverted, and that's why I want to know. And and Solomon, there you go. You said you learned something about Georgia tonight. You're very welcome.
thank you.
Go to George. Just go to gregpalast.com. Watch his movie Vigilantes Inc. Because that information, that was because of his research. He put that in there. But it's important to see these ties because he does not. Governor Kemp in Georgia does not want you to know that his family introduced slavery to the state. It was a free state.
Wow,
The
wow.
black people who lived in Georgia up until his family became these big oligarchs in the state, they were free people up until
Mhm.
that point. Because every state in the United States was not a slave state. I'm not saying that racism
Mhm.
did not exist. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying that everybody was not enslaved.
No. And
So
racism is another tool the oligarch loves to use,
how so?
because if you can demonize a group of people and say they're not worth as much as us white people,
Hmm.
then you can force people to work for less money. You can get people to mistreat them, keep them divided, because if the race is all united, and of course they're not even different races, we shouldn't even call it racism. There's only the human race, right?
Yeah.
But by making these fake divisions between us based on skin color or Iceland or whatever, it's like they they keep us from looking up. We keep looking at each other and fighting amongst ourselves instead of realizing we're all being stepped on by these oligarchs.
And we're seeing it. You know what? Can you stay with me a little while, Lisa
I
Peace?
can, sure.
Yeah, because I really want us to dig down, because as this news continues to come out, I think we need to understand what it is that we're looking at. We have to. I want you to help us to. I want you to walk us through what we need to be looking for, the questions that we need to be asking, because understandably, um, different family members, the Kings and the Kennedys, have said, "Wait a minute, let sleeping dogs lie." The Kings have not said that. They've said, "We
No, the
like to
king
see."
sued. They
They said,
sued the government and won. Yeah.
but they said, "We want to see the papers first, please," which I can
Yes.
understand. But let me just say this for everyone, because we're about to close this segment out and we're going to reopen the next one. People are human. People are human, and we have to grow up in our politics and grow up in how we relate to each other and understand each other and understand that people are a mix of a lot of things. There's nothing you could tell me about Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, Dr. King that's going to change my opinions of the good things that they did. Nothing you can tell me.
Hmm.
Might be interesting, it's gossip, it's wonderful gossip fodder,
Yeah.
but
A
that's
lot
not
of
going
that
to tell.
gossip, by the way, isn't even true. All
It's
the people that
but
claim they slept with them, a lot of that's
what
not even
what
true. Yeah.
but and they
Yeah.
put things out there on people, but the thing
Yeah.
is, let folks do what they do. The thing is,
Hmm.
the person who cracked the racial code in the United States of America was Dr. King, and not just a racial code, but a moral code. And I
Yes.
would say with that, when I look at John Kennedy, and it was said of him that, wait a minute, when his children were in the White House, he became almost fanatical about nuclear disarmament,
Yes.
denuclearization. He wanted peace because he also had been in war and he nearly lost his life in it.
Right?
Robert
He
Kennedy,
knew how bad war was, and he didn't wanna,
he
be the cause of it, and he definitely understood how nuclear weapons worked and the power there,
that's right.
and, he and Khrushchev were writing letters secretly, transported by, Norman Cousins, and, saying, I think Khrushchev wrote, "We may not agree on a lot of things, but we both want the arc to continue,"
Well,
basically the arc of human life to continue.
and Robert
Yes.
Kennedy and the first lady Jackie Kennedy, after his brother, her husband, had been killed, reached out to Khrushchev and they said, "Look, we hope that you will stay on the path of peace."
Yes.
So if that's
And
going
they
to
also
happen,
said, and we know the Soviets didn't kill,
that's right.
JFK. We
That's
know it was, a right-wing faction that did,
here in
Yeah,
the United
yeah.
States, and
And
that's
the
why.
CIA people were extremely right-wing at that point in time. They
Yeah.
were extremely, oligarchic supportive.
So I
Yes.
want you to stay right here because I want us to understand what it is that we're looking at. It's
Yes.
very, very important for us to really understand what's being thrown at us, because so much is being thrown at us at one time. I think we're not going to be a whole people until we understand what happened to these men.
Mhm.
And then that's going to shake loose what happened to Malcolm X.
Yes.
It's going to help us to understand what happened to Lumumba, to Che Guevara. You can just keep on going.
It's
It-
because
It's
it's all the same
it's
plot in a way. It's
it's
all about
all the
anybody
same.
who challenges the global oligarchy and their plans has to go by any means necessary, and if they can make it look like some low-level guy did it, all the
Yeah.
better, you
And
know?
nobody, and the thing is, they're hurting everybody because no one believes it. So stay right there, everybody.
Yes.
Got Lisa Pease, the author of the book, A Lie Too Big to Fail. It's the real history of the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And so many people tie the Kennedy assassinations to the King assassination, and there are ties. Indeed, after Dr. King finished giving his speech opposing the Vietnam War, and he labored over whether to publicly oppose it, he knew that he was going to do it, but when he finally got there, he knew that he had signed his death warrant. He knew that when John Kennedy had been killed, he told his co-workers, his colleagues. I won't live
Mhm.
to the decade. He said that.
Yeah, I
And,
won't get there with you. I've been to the mountaintop, but I'm
what,
not going to get there with
and
you. He
and he had
knew.
been
He totally
he'd been
understood.
suffering with migraines, depression, because the intelligence community had harassed him, and and in fact, the only time one of his marches ended in violence, the week before he was killed,
Hmm.
there was an instigator who was a Morehouse man who was CIA connected.
Yep.
So we need to understand what we're looking at, everybody. So stay right here. I'm talking to Lisa Pease. I want you to get this book, A Lie Too Big to Fail. Follow her on X. Follow her on Blue Sky. Follow her. Give her your support because she is supporting us. The only way that our republic is going to survive is if we take these issues apart. If our democracy is going to thrive, if it's going to grow, we've got to take these issues apart. We've got to. We've got to do this together. And we're old enough. We're grown enough.
The
We're not.
truth will set you free, right? That's
It's going to
right
set us
there in the
all free.
Bible, and that truer words were never spoken.
Stay right here. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota, the Santita Jackson Show. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to part two. As I'm talking with Lisa Pease, the brilliant investigator whose book, A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert Kennedy. She's with us, and we've been talking really not just about the assassination of Robert Kennedy, but linking it to what happened to JFK, linking it to what happened to Dr. King, linking it because there's a tie, there are ties. And it has been speculated, certainly by people who work for Dr. King, that it was the same factions killed them. And we've got to talk about why. We've got to talk about how. I want you to meet Lisa Pease is on Blue Sky, as am I. Meet us there. Meet us there.
Mhm.
LISA.PEASE. That's right. And I'm Santita Jackson. We're both at BSKY.social. And we are also, by our names, on X. But I'm Santita J. So go
I'm still Lisa Pease.
He's still Lisa Pease. I'm Santita J. And of course, the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. And I think I saw someone I went to high school with, Jeff Schwenk, who came up. Love you, Jeff. He's an absolutely brilliant guy. He was the valedictorian of our class, and I think he went to work for the State Department. And my father would see him sometimes when he would leave the country, and I was like, "Oh, he's the smartest guy in the world, Dad." And he said, "Extremely bright, very, very nice young man." Well, we're not so young anymore, Jeff, but it's all right. I'm so glad to see you. Sending you so much love. Everybody, let's talk about President Trump issuing the executive order to open up the files of the assassinations of JFK, MLK, and RFK. I don't know how people got through that period. Hey, D. Ray. Hey, Andre. Hey, Bernadette.
Mhm.
Robert, shalom to you, Solomon, and Mike, and Carol Soskin, and Bernadette, and so many of you out there. I don't know how anyone got through that period. I don't know how folks went from, I don't know how you got from JFK. First of all, you had Medgar Evers,
Right.
then you had JFK, then
Then MLK, and then Malcolm X,
Malcolm X,
and then
and
RFK. I mean,
just
5 leaders of the left killed in a 5-year period.
in the
I
United
mean,
States.
the shockwave of that, and I think there was a lot of denial, like, after JFK was killed, a lot of people, their first instinct, especially when they saw Oswald killed on live TV, their first
What was
instinct
that
was
like?
he was being silenced. I've talked to people live at the time, and that's kind of what everybody thought, and it's funny, even people who have denied conspiracy for years, but recently, a lot of the original footage has been released, and
Mhm.
I recently, one of the news channels, I think it was NBC, like, ran the original footage, like, all weekend like they had originally, and somebody's like, "Wow, watching that, I see why people think it was a conspiracy. It looked like Oswald was shot to silence him," which of course he was. That's exactly why he was shot. And but I think people were in denial, like, this can't happen here in America. And then it happened again. It happened with Malcolm X, right? In 1965. And then, still it's like, oh, but that was Muslims, that wasn't the government. But I think strongly it was the government. And I actually talk about that in my RFK book. I have a little bit about Malcolm X. There was a reporter, gosh, I'm blanking on his name right now. I'm so sorry. As I get older, the names don't come as fast as they
No,
used
that's
to.
why we have to get the book.
Yeah,
A Lie Too Big to Fail, everybody. You got to get it.
thank you. But, very big name, well established. James Reston. He
Yes.
got a tip that something big was going to happen at the Malcolm X talk that night. And he went and he sat in the back. And then he later denied that. He wrote about it at first, and he actually noted, I think, that there were 2 people arrested on site, because then they caught 2 more later. And then later the story was rewritten that only 1 guy was caught on site, and the other 2 were kind of quietly shuffled to the back of the article. And then, of course, we know now, because the Malcolm X family has sued for the truth, that none of those guys were really the shooters. One was, but the other 2 were wrongly arrested. And it sounds very much like an intelligence agency plot designed to frame certain people, again, to pull focus away from any possible political higher level conspiracy. And then we have, Martin Luther King at the start of 1968, in April of 1968. By the way, a year to the day after he gave that
To the minute.
anti-Vietnam War speech.
To the minute.
To the minute. I don't think those things are accidental. In fact, I found an article by E. Howard Hunt, where he said the CIA picks dates very carefully for its operations for maximum psychological impact. And I thought, what better way to send a message to people in the peace movement than killing the guy who spoke out against the war at the same time, a year later, that he had, opposed that war. And then, of course, a couple months later, then Bobby is killed. And by then, people were numb. They're like, what is happening? Our country's unraveling. I think a lot of people went into kind of an emotional hiding after that. Because after JFK was killed, there was still some energy to persevere and carry on. But after the next 2 deaths or the next 3 deaths, that energy was gone. And Democrats especially knew, because King was not a Democrat. He was really a socialist. I mean, by his own words, he didn't believe in the Republican or the Democratic Party, and I finally understand why.
He had evolved into that, because it was, I think, what from as my parents, and because they wouldn't have described him as a socialist, but what he, I think, when you looked at him philosophically, he felt that materialism, this grab at all of all the consumption,
Consume.
was horrible. The racism, the militarism. When you mentioned Smedley Butler in the last hour, I said, wait a minute, he's the guy who wrote. Yes, her book is on Amazon. Solomon Get It. When he wrote
War is a Racket.
War's a Racket. I mean,
for the rich, he literally said war is a racket for the rich. He's like, I was sent to defend the oil for Standard Oil, and I was sent to this country, to defend this corporation. And he saw the direct connection. And so that kind of brings us full circle to what you keep asking. Why do these assassinations matter? I think we have to understand that rich people want what they want, and they're willing to kill people all over the globe and even at home to get it. And people who stand up and oppose that need to be taken out of the way. And if the people understood that our own government was responsible for some of these assassinations, I think there are people who believe, I'm not one of them, by the way, but I think there are people who believe the CIA would be destroyed if the truth came out. I actually think people will go, wow, finally the CIA came clean. Now the CIA finally has some credibility. I think there are people who will feel that way. I also think there are people who say the CIA shouldn't exist. And of course, John Kennedy was in that camp. And he actually I that's another reason I think John Kennedy was killed. He was trying to move the power of the CIA's covert action back into military control because he didn't feel the CIA should be running their own little terror operations. He
Mhm.
wanted everything under the strict military command, where everything had to be approved in advance through a hierarchy, because that's how the military works. And of course, the CIA vigorously opposed that. And Kennedy went so far as to set up the Defense Intelligence Agency, where he was planning on moving the CIA covert operations. And in the film JFK, there's that character, Mr. X, who
Mm.
talks about this sent shockwaves through the agency. And there are literally quotes. One of them was like the worst quote I ever read was something like, he was going to take away our fun and games, meaning our ability to kill and shoot people that we wanted to overthrow, our fun and games. I'm like, oh my God, that's the mentality. I talked to somebody who was a CI operative just a couple of days ago, and he said, they tested him for empathy and he came out with zero empathy. And the CI loved that because that's the people they want to employ, because those are the people who will go out and overthrow people and not think twice. They think they're doing their patriotic duty to their country.
And
And it's,
because
yeah,
it's a CIA operative. He,
yeah.
he has a Greek last name. Is it John Kiriakou? I think something like
Yeah, that's one of the whistleblowers, yes,
that. And he said that a particular social pathology that the CIA recruiters look for are people without empathy. Wow,
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
scary.
Like I said, I heard that from, yeah, somebody I know well who, yeah, it's like, wow.
Ooh,
You know,
but,
and
but
so you can understand why they had no problem getting people to kill their own president. If you have no empathy and, you believe, as many of them did, that Kennedy was selling us out to the communists, because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy said, we're not going to invade Cuba. We're never going back to Cuba. We've made our peace with Castro. That's it. And that really upset the CIA because they all wanted Cuba back. That was like an emotional attachment. I mean, basically, it's like that was their Hawaii. I mean, they used to go there and swim in the gorgeous blue waters and, gamble at the lovely casinos. I mean, Cuba was like very desirable land for them. And for Kennedy to say, no, we're never going there, they were furious at Kennedy, and all their anti-Castro Cuban assets were furious at Kennedy. I mean, just beyond belief. And then they turned all their efforts to Vietnam. It's like, well, we can't go into Cuba. All right, let's go to Vietnam and let's set up stuff there. And guess what? It's another tropical paradise. It's just further away. And if we kill enough people, we can control that too. And of course, they couldn't possibly kill enough people to control that. You can't kill people on their own homeland. It just doesn't work. People won't give it up. I mean, look what Israel's trying to do in Gaza. You can't kill them all. You just can't. They will keep coming back because it's their home. And people will fight to the death to defend their home in a way that an invader will not fight to the death. And in Ukraine, it's a little different because there is a Russian population within Ukraine. So there's like uh,
they have gone
mixed
back.
people there, and yeah, it
They
has
have
been
gone
part
back
of
and
Russia at times, and
Ukraine
it's,
has gone
yeah,
back and forth
and
because
I
so
feel
many of
horrible for
them are
the people
Russian.
caught in the middle. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think it's a horrible war. All wars are horrible. All wars are theft, is what I like to say,
Oh,
because the only reason we ever go to war is to steal somebody's land, resources, military bases, harbors. We always have an agenda that is not the one that they're telling us. It's always about money, bottom line. And this is again why I think both Kennedys were killed for sure. They both understood that because they were wealthy. They had a lot of wealthy friends and they heard what they talked about and they disagreed with them on this. They didn't feel we had the right to go in and steal the resources of another country just because we're bigger and stronger. And Kennedy bent over backwards to allow um, other nations their dignity. It's like Trump goes to Canada, it's like, we're going to buy Canada or we're going to take Greenland from Denmark. I mean, he allows those countries no dignity. He might have been able to buy Greenland, maybe if he'd gone about that in a subtle way and talked to them behind the scenes and worked out a deal in small and quiet and long term or something. But to just say, hey, we're big and we're rich and we're going to just take that from you, that never goes over well. I mean, it's just a bully. America has become the world's bully. And because of that, we have no credibility. We're losing friends right and left. The UN's, on the verge of kicking us out, even though we basically fund the UN, but we've vetoed so many things where it was literally us and maybe one other country like Israel vetoing things that the rest of the world says this is bad. And the US says, no, no, we want to do this. So therefore it's not bad. And this is not how we should be treating other nations. It's not how we should treat each other as neighbors. I get upset when, I've got a friend who just hates MAGA. I hate MAGA. I'm like, don't hate them. We are all a product of our information. And I have different information than they do. And if they knew what I did, they would understand more of what I'm saying and they would not be MAGA. And if I only knew what they knew, I would be MAGA, right? It's all about where our information base is. So it's so important we not hate each other. I don't hate Trump. I don't like him. I don't personally want him to be my president, but I don't hate him. He too is the product of his upbringing. And I want to change things peacefully. And again, this is what the Kennedys wanted. They wanted to change the world peacefully. They wanted to give aid to other nations to change their minds about the way they were running things, as opposed to sending in the military. So when he wants Sukarno to be less communistic in Indonesia, he offered to build them roads and schools. As soon as Kennedy's out of office, LBJ is sending them tankers and bombs. And, it's just a completely different mentality. And it's almost like they were so far morally, spiritually ahead of their time. And it's such a shame that the world couldn't catch up fast enough. And certainly people in our country couldn't catch up fast enough. And so I think it's so imperative that we can't change other people. We can only change ourselves. That's why I've always loved that Michael Jackson song, The Man in the Mirror. And I think of that often. It's like, I'm sorry I'm getting emotional, but
it's okay.
Yeah, if I want a more peaceful world, I have to personally be more peaceful to others and treat them with more respect.
Well,
And it's a tiny drop, but these drops create those ripples.
well,
And I think that's what we can do.
I think about Michael Jackson because I get emotional thinking about him because he was fighting for
I loved him. Yeah.
Well, when he died, Dick Gregory told him not to come back to the United States.
Yeah.
People do not understand is that Michael Jackson was one of the biggest music moguls on earth. He had one of the top 3 most profitable music catalogs in the industry.
And he was taking power back from Sony. He like bought out his contracts and stuff because he's like, you're ripping me off and I'm not going to take it. So
they owed him so much money.
The oligarch.
They owed him so much money, he would have bankrupted the company.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is when I've seen these people, and that's why I want to walk through while we're here. So we only have about 40 minutes or so, but I need you to help people. Let the Robert Kennedy, let that case help people to understand why it's important for us to open the files. Because it's Sirhan standing in front.
Right. The truth. But the provable, documentable truth is so far different from the story that is shoved down our throat. It's really night and day. And until we can get the media to tell the truth, and honestly, I think the Robert Kennedy case is the most transparent. That's one of the reasons I wanted to write about it. I thought this is the easiest one for people to understand because you only have, 2 people, they're facing each other. Again, Sirhan's gun is 3 feet from Kennedy by the witnesses who saw them both at the moment of the shooting. And yet Kennedy, is killed from behind his right ear over here. And so obviously the guy standing in front of him cannot suddenly reach around behind him. So then they try and say, well, Kennedy spun around, but they're still 3 feet apart. And then they say, well, Sirhan lunged, except that he couldn't because he was being held in a headlock by a guard. And Kennedy was shot 4 times from behind. The shot to the ear is what killed him, but he was actually shot 3 other times from behind at a distance again of about an inch and a half. And so there's just no way you can reconcile that. Whereas Sirhan was captured after the second shot and his gun moved physically away from the crowd. So there's just no way he could have shot and killed Robert Kennedy. That is 100% provable, very easy. There's a ton of witness evidence to show where Sirhan was relative to Kennedy. And then we have the autopsy evidence. And the coroner actually took live pig ears, I mean, not live pig ears, but ears cut from pigs, and stuck them on wood and started firing a gun at them at moving back a little bit at a time until he could find, the matching powder burn mark so that he could tell how far the gun away, because there was soot and powder burn from the gunfire at Kennedy's right ear. And so he said that the closest matching pattern was at the inch and a half mark. That was exactly where the pattern was, the same amount of, soot from the gun, basically. And so they knew that, the shooter had to be that close. And no one bothered to say, but Sirhan wasn't there. And in the court, I'm like, how could they get away with this in front of a jury? And what they did, which was actually very clever, is they mocked up a model of the pantry and they divided it into inch squares that they said represented 2 feet. All right. And then they would ask witnesses to point to the square where somebody was standing. And it's like, well, Sirhan was in this square and Robert Kennedy was in that square. So it looked like they were like an inch apart, because on the board they were an inch apart. But again, each of those squares is 2 feet, and Sirhan was like at the end of one, and Robert Kennedy was at the end of the other, and they were really, 3.5 feet or so apart. So that's how they kind of fooled the jury into not noticing this distance and positioning issue. And of course, we didn't know any of this stuff until 20 years later, because after the trial, and I actually include a little bit about this in my book, the judge and the prosecution and even the defense, they got together in a room. It's like, what are we going to do about the records? Are we going to release them or not? And they ended up talking about dummying up fake bullets to show the public rather than let them see the real bullets. And it looks like they actually did do that, which is in my book. I don't have time or the inclination to go into that right now. But they also talked about keeping the price of file copies super high. So if somebody wanted a Xerox of a page, they would have to pay like a premium price for it instead of, what it actually cost them, which was like pennies. And so they made it very hard for any researcher to get a hold of the files. And then they also managed to keep them entirely secret for 20 years. So they weren't released to the public until 1988. And then, of course, they're released on microfilm. And in those days, that meant you literally had to go sit in the library and put a little reel, through the threader, and then roll it manually forward and backward and zoom in and zoom out, because you can't even read the whole page in a frame that way, which, by the way, is how I got started in this case. I happened to work near the downtown Central Library, and I would go there, and I was researching the JFK assassination at first. And then one day I pulled out the wrong drawer. I was looking for some microfilm I had looked at the day before, and I just was a drawer over, and I saw that those were the LAPD files. And I knew enough to know that, again, they had only been released like 4 years earlier, because this was 1992 when I was starting to get into this. And I thought, wow, I bet I'll find something on these files that no one else has found. And of course I found a lot, because, again, who's sitting there going through the microfilm? You have to be a real nerd, to want to sit and read all these records.
I think, you're very, very curious. And I think that when you are a researcher, that is what you do, and you can do that to the exclusion of everything else.
Which I did, which is why I'm not married.
Well,
I just dove in and never came up for air.
Well, I mean, but why have you been so driven to find out what happened?
Because these people mattered. These people really were trying to create the world that I want to live in, a world where people played fair and took care of each other. And so it matters who killed them. These weren't random accidents, and it matters almost even more that the media has not yet acknowledged the truth of what happened. And this is, I think, again, this led directly to the election of Trump because he's the first candidate who called out, fake news, fake media. And to a degree, he was right. They'll tell the truth about some things, but they have yet to tell the truth about the Robert Kennedy assassination or the JFK. In fact, in the JFK assassination, when the House Select Committee in the 70s came to the conclusion that it was a probable conspiracy, and that was their conclusion, the Washington Post actually wrote an article suggesting maybe it was two lone nuts shooting at the same time. That's how far they went to avoid conspiracy.
But
I mean, just
but
the
Lisa,
ludicrousness.
it is ludicrous. And what's so
Yeah.
awful is that now their credibility is so damaged. The overwhelming
Right.
majority of Americans do not trust corporate media, and
Yeah.
we're not
And that's
operating with the same set of facts anymore.
right.
I'm
And
not
not
saying that we haven't been lied to for a long
Yeah,
time. I
and
think
it's
we have.
good to be aware and to question and to challenge, but what's not good is when none of us know who we can trust, and so we don't trust anybody. And that's kind of what's destroying America. Because when you grew up, there were only 3 channels on TV, right? ABC,
Oh,
CBS, and NBC, and that was it. You only
and they
had 3
and they
choices.
signed
Yeah.
off with the Star Spangled Banner.
There you go, there you go. So we had a much more, at least a shared reality, even if it
Yeah.
wasn't true then, which it wasn't, but we had more of a shared reality. Now with the internet and podcasts, there are so many different voices with different opinions and different sets of facts, and frankly, a lot of disinformation and misinformation, because there are very well-meaning people who repeat stuff that I know for a fact is not true. And it's very hard to run and chase them all down. It's like playing whack-a-mole for the rest of my life. I can't do that. I don't have that much energy. I did that for years, but it's like there are, again, well-meaning, good, well-educated people, well-read people who still get it wrong. And in fact, I will say this about Robert Kennedy. That's actually how I met him, is that David Talbot introduced me to Robert Kennedy Jr. because Robert Kennedy Jr. had something very wrong about the JFK case, and David Talbot had tried talking him out of it, and he couldn't. Nothing he said was ringing with him. He's like, I need somebody who understands this particular thing better than I do. And I said, actually, I know about that thing that you're talking about. We wrote about that in Pro Magazine. I can talk to him about that. So he sent it to me, and I gave him, the facts up front, and he didn't believe me either. But I then went and I said, give me 2 more days. I'm going to find you something really solid. And I did. I went because it basically is this guy who claimed he shot JFK and then bit the shell and stuck it in Dealey Plaza. Well, a shell was found in Dealey Plaza, right where he said, with his teeth marks on it. And so that was convincing to Bobby. But I was able to prove that shell was not manufactured until 1972, based on the markings on it. So obviously he couldn't have shot him in, 63 and bit that shell because it hadn't been invented yet. It wasn't created until 72. So even somebody, again, well meaning, very serious, credible, intelligent, still can get it wrong. So we can't have any gods. We can't believe that anybody is always right. We do, it's a huge burden on us citizens to try and figure out who has the truth and who doesn't.
Mhm.
But there are people who have a better record of credibility overall than others. And those are the ones you should try and find and listen to and test them out. Whenever I get a new book, and I check, first of all, is it footnoted? Because if it's not footnoted, I kind of throw it away. I can't use it. I don't
Mhm.
know what their primary original sources were, or if somebody's just whispering in their ear and they're writing it down. But if it is footnoted, I go actually check out a few of the footnotes, because you can usually tell very quickly, especially on the more extreme claims. I read something in a book by C. David Heyman, and he had a footnote, and I went and looked at it, and it wasn't on that page. And so I went and looked through the rest of the book, and I finally found what he was referring to, and it said the opposite of what he was saying in the book. And I'm like, well, that's not very credible. And then that happened like 3 or 4 times in a row. I'm like, see, David Heyman is not credible, and I'm never going to use his stuff again. He's just making things up, and he's sourcing real things, so you think it's real. So again, it's not even enough to just look at the footnotes and see if they're there. You literally have to verify. And people say, well, that's too much work. Why should I do it? And I'm like, this is the price of living in a democracy. All right. It's not just a given. There are always going to be forces who want to take that democracy away from us, who want to take our vote away, who want to take our knowledge away, who want us to live in a false reality. And the only way we can fight back is to try and find some truths on our own.
Will we, as these files are released, such as they are,
Such as they are, yeah.
Whatever it is that we get, what questions should we be asking? Should we be asking the same questions about these 3 assassinations, JFK, RFK, MLK, or are there different questions that we should be asking about each one?
In terms of knowing if the files are real or knowing if they're valuable, I mean, I kind of have my own personal list of things I'm looking for. For example, the CIA did a lot of work on the Robert Kennedy assassination, was in constant contact with the LAPD. Are we ever going to see those files? Because I don't think most people even know they exist. There was no congressional investigation in the RFK case, and so they might have destroyed those files or hidden them or just claimed they don't have them. But I know they have them because I saw the other end of the conversation in the LAPD files. And they called, the CIA was known to law enforcement as Goliath. So there are a couple of, references to Goliath in the police files. And I would like to see the rest of the conversation from the CIA's end. So that would be something that would indicate, some thing. But, as we said in the previous hour, do I expect to see confessions or acknowledgments? No. And in fact, there's what I believe to be a fake document that's circulating saying, yes, Lee Harvey Oswald was naval intelligence, and that's why we covered up the fact that he killed Kennedy. Well, I know it's fake because Oswald couldn't have killed Kennedy. He wasn't on the 6th floor. He wasn't on the grassy knoll. He didn't have nitrate on his cheek. Couldn't have fired that gun that day. So we get a lot of these fake documents, and the CIA has acknowledged adding fake documents to their own databases. They have acknowledged this on the record. So it's extremely difficult. Yep. So it's like there is no simple answer to any of these things. But I think, like I said, more than knowing what happened, it is at least important to know what couldn't have happened and what shouldn't still be reported as if it happened. James O'Reilly did not kill Martin Luther King. Sirhan Sirhan did not kill Robert Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill JFK. Those 3 statements are provable. All right, proving who did kill them is very much more difficult, but proving who didn't is rather simple. And I think we need to look at things sometimes that way. And if the media even started reporting that, the alleged assassin who was convicted in court, that would be a truthful statement. But when they say the assassin of Robert Kennedy, that's not truthful. That's simply not truthful, even though that's what the court determined. But that, just because it's said in court, still doesn't make it truthful. It makes it a legal truth, but not an actual truth.
Well, what is it? What can you help me to understand what has made certainly, had it happened to me, I would not rest until not only until I found out the truth, but I want other people to know also. Robert Kennedy, he has gone further than his family, which,
yes.
Look, I'm not blaming anyone, because what
They
happened is that
had such a tough life, and they are
yeah,
not their parents. I mean, that's the
no,
other thing. I think we expect them all to be just like JFK and RFK, and they're not.
yeah,
JFK and RFK really had to earn their way in society. The kids were just born into it. And Ethel was a bit of a crazy woman herself. I mean, and by crazy, I mean in a fun, wild way,
eccentric.
yeah, very bigger than life sort of person. And so she did let her kids run wild. And also, she had 11 kids now and no husband. She can't take care of all of them at once. It's too much for any one person.
Well,
And Ted Kennedy, who tried to help,
oh,
was still trying to take care of JFK's kids.
well,
So he
I
already
can't.
had his own and them, and then he's supposed to look after this brood too. And a
Yeah.
family friend told me at one point, and I don't know if this is true. I have no way to verify that, but I'll just share that. I got a call from somebody who claimed to be a family friend and said things that led me to believe she was credible in that. But she said at one point, Ted gathered the family after Bobby was killed. He gathered the family and said, none of us are going to look into these assassinations anymore because he felt that Bobby was killed because he had been looking into the JFK assassination, which he truly was. And I think the CIA was terrified that Bobby, who was again a Senate investigator, he knew how to investigate, he knew how to read records, he knew all the players, they couldn't keep things from him. And so he would have known what to ask to get to the records. So they didn't want him to get to the White House where he could reopen an investigation and uncover the role and possibly take action on that. So the idea that we will now, this many years later, get any kind of justice, I certainly don't hold that illusion. I do think we'll get more of the story, at least in the JFK case and probably in the Martin Luther King case. In the RFK case, I think they're going to just say, hey, that was an LAPD investigation. We don't have any federal records. And like I said, I know for a fact they do because I've seen the other end of some of those conversations, but most people don't. I mean, there aren't that many people who've read my book yet, that could challenge the government or the mainstream media on that point. I could, but not a lot of people could.
We're talking with Lisa Pease. People are asking if you can get your book on Amazon.
You cannot get the hardcover right now.
Right.
Unfortunately, it got so expensive to print that they stopped and they were going to switch to paperback. And then, of course, the publisher ran into a cash flow issue. So the paperback has been pushed into July now. You
Hmm.
can still get the book on Kindle or ebooks. And it is in a lot of libraries. I don't, I'm not asking for money for this. Go get a free copy at the library
Hmm.
and read it from there. And that's a great way to read it and a great way to support your local library because the more
Why?
people who are in and out, the more support they get.
Absolutely. But why? Because this does not pay you money. It doesn't.
No. I've lost way more money than I've ever made on this case. Absolutely.
But
I mean,
why
my
just,
whole career has been this, and I have not moved up in my work career because
yeah.
I've been so focused on this. And it just, I don't know, it feels to me the truth about what happened would tell us so. I think it tells us so much about the world we're in now, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I learned more about the Palestinian conflict reading the trial transcript than I did reading any mainstream news article,
Really?
because yeah, there was a quite a bit of the history of Israel and Palestine and the Nakba and the horrors that happened. And I talk about some of that in my book because that's what I was learning. And it's I also found it, I have to say, endlessly fascinating. I won't pretend it was entirely a burden. I was very curious, and it was such a deep, rich nest. But it's a lot like sifting for gold, or looking for a needle in a haystack, as they say. I could read 100 pages with nothing of interest, and then one sentence in that 101st page would have something really important, like seeing the word Goliath and knowing from a different book I had read that that was a code for the CIA and LAPD, and being able to match that up then to some other things that happened. So, and I also knew if I didn't do it, no one else would. And I really didn't want to write a book. I resisted it for a very long time. And it wasn't until I think it was um, I won't even say his name, but some other researcher wrote his big book that everybody had been expecting and waiting for. And then it came out and it didn't tell the parts that I knew. And I thought, damn it, I'm going to have to write this book.
Mm.
I didn't want to because I don't like to sit down. I love to be out and play in the beach and walk in a park. And I mean, my fantasy life is just watching dolphins from the shore. That's the kind of life I want to lead. I don't want to have to deal with all this, dark, deadly politics, depressing stuff. But I knew if I didn't, no one else would. And I felt like the knowledge had almost been gifted to me. There were times I would go into the library and a book would literally like jump off the shelf into my hands and fall open at a spot. And sure, I must have bumped it or somebody on the other side bumped it. I mean, I'm not claiming any supernatural powers, but it happened more than once. It's just little weird things. And every time I've tried to kind of get away from the case, some big thing has happened to kind of suck me back in.
Pulling you back.
So, yeah, exactly. Because like I said, I really want to go play with dolphins. That's what I really want to do.
But the thing is, I think this is this case cannot and does not go away.
No.
And so we need
And
we need
Sirhan is
people-
still alive and innocent
Yeah.
and in jail. And so somebody
And
asked
Bobby
me, now that
Kennedy
you've written
called
this.
for him to be released, right?
Yes, he did. He wrote a letter and he showed up at his online, because of course this was during COVID lockdown, so they had online parole hearings, and he showed up for the first hearing. Sadly, he blew him off the next two hearings because he was running for president.
Ah.
And on the one hand, I understand. On the other hand, he put the defense in a very precarious position because they had a plan to go forward without him. And then he kind of pushed his way in and said, no, I'll be there. I'll be there. And then at the very last minute, he pulled out and they had to scramble to get somebody else to fill his slot. So like I said, he's a good guy on many levels, but no one's perfect. And he definitely has some flaws.
Well,
And, keeping to his word seemed tough when he was running for president. Let's put it that way.
well, I would think that he'd be pulled in a lot of different directions because certainly the power structure, I would think, would not want Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yeah.
to be asking these questions because he's not only is he very well educated, he's an incredibly bright man.
Well, and he's super popular. He's got a lot of followers and power. So of course they don't want him asking. But sadly, his family doesn't either. And he called me up one night because, he would call me frequently. What's the name of that guy who did blah, blah, blah? And I would know, and I would tell him, and that would be the end of the phone call.
Mm-hmm.
But one time he called and he asked about a book that I knew had been written in 1969. I'm like, what do you want to know about that book? And evidently his family had read it and found it convincing that Sirhan had done it. Well, the book was published in 1969. And remember, I said the files showing all this about the distance and the positioning, the autopsy report, that didn't come out till 1988. So nothing written before that point could have been accurate because those files weren't even available yet. And in fact, the files might never have been available except that somebody inside the police wrote his own book on the case. And that became the legal leverage saying, well, if he got access to the files, other authors should have access to the files too. But it took 20 years to pry those files free. So
is he positioned differently now that he's the secretary of HHS?
How do I want to say it? I fear because he really wanted to be president that he backed off of defending Sirhan because he didn't want to upset his Israeli backers because they are vested in a Palestinian having killed his brother and that narrative. And he sat there silently while Rabbi Shmuley was spewing, what I know to be
hatred.
Misinformation. Yeah.
And hatred. I mean, that's what he does.
I can't stand that guy. Yeah. There's nothing.
He's a dangerous
about somebody like that. Yes.
And so, okay, so you think that this has informed his politics in the Middle East then?
Well, I had a conversation with him when after October 7th happened. I started texting him because that was the best way to reach him. Email, you
Mhm.
never knew if you would get him or not. But I was texting him like, Bobby, this is actually your chance to really differentiate yourself from the rest of the field. Everybody's supporting Israel, but if you stand up for the Palestinians, you will show that you are truly anti-war, truly independent. And he wrote back, saying, "Oh, no, I'm not going to do that." And we had a few exchanges, and at one point in one of these exchanges, he basically said words to the effect, "Maybe it's better this way," meaning maybe it's better if this time Israel kills all the Palestinians. And when he said that, I had to break all ties with him because I can't I can't believe he said that. I know he said it because I was there, and he kind of doubled down on that on some TV shows in the weeks that followed, so I knew it wasn't just an offhand comment. And people said, well, maybe he's being blackmailed, and he said at one point, he's like, I am not being blackmailed on this is what I believe. He said Israel is our aircraft carrier in the Middle East, and it's strategically important. And he said, and this is, again, there's video of this online, he said that the Palestinians were the most pampered people on the planet. And
Yeah.
when he said that,
Yes.
he,
Yeah.
because he meant in terms of international aid, they get more per capita than anybody else. I'm like, they need more per capita than anybody else because no one else is attacked as much as they are. No one else has to rebuild all their infrastructure from scratch. Of course, they're getting money. And I honestly don't know how to reconcile that, because I know that he really thinks Sirhan did not kill his father. It's not like he hates Palestinians because Sirhan was Palestinian. But again, I think he feels that without the Jewish vote, he could never be president, and he was therefore willing to sell out the entire Palestinian population in the same way that Hillary was willing to sell out the Iraqis to be president with her Iraq war vote. I mean, people make those, and people try and defend those choices like, oh, but they're running for president. And in my mind, no, I don't want somebody running for president to make those choices because I know John Kennedy would not have, I know his father would not have made those statements or those choices, you know.
Well,
Ugh,
I mean, what?
it makes me
Hmm.
sick to my stomach to even have to talk about that because I just, ugh.
It,
And
it's
I
because
loved him. I just loved this guy
I
until
do.
that.
No, I still do, because I also
Yeah.
see someone. Wow, for him to still be standing is a heck
And
of a
I
feat.
know I give them a lot of credit, and
I
people get
just,
down on him for his drug use. And I point out that he is rehabilitated, and that's a really hard thing to
wait,
do. And we should
Lisa,
never, ever dump on somebody for past drug use.
Lisa, I've never taken a puff off a marijuana cigarette.
Me
My
either.
my my
Yay.
my, my drug of choice was food.
Yeah,
Just the
gosh, mine
thought
too.
of, and what, I mean, Kim
Yeah.
Whitney, the renowned television comedian. Well, she's a comedian, and she's been on television for years. She laughs about. I've known Kim since we were teenagers. Um, she laughs about coming to visit. She grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Her family, very successful architectural firm, and she had come in, and she was neighbors with my parents' lawyer, who was also one of Dr. King's lawyers, John Bustamante, who's since passed on.
Oh,
And
wow.
she kept hearing about the Jacksons and how much fun they were, because they used to come and be with us almost every weekend. And so she came in. She said, "We're driving down your street, and I see these flashing lights." I'm like, "Okay, what's going on over here?" It's a nice old quiet neighborhood. And she said, "And your family were running out of the house because someone was threatening to blow up your home." And she said, "I wondered." I said, "Oh, well, we bless their hearts." I said, "We had worked out how that was supposed to go, you know." And she looked at me. She said, "You do know that that's kind of crazy." I said, "Well, I've lived the crazy, and I
Yeah.
get."
Yeah. You've been
I,
inside the whirlwind there. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I said so, but so I get it. So when I look at him, and having been knocked all the way down as a child,
Hmm.
and yes, Did he have according to reports, he had a chaotic upbringing, but this woman, Ethel Kennedy, had a baby. She was pregnant while her husband was shot while she's standing with him.
Yeah, Rory, who never even got to meet him. Yeah.
She had, and then she went, number one, she carried the child to term
Mm-hmm.
and had the baby by the end of the year. Who can
By
do
herself.
that?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
who? Hey, y'all, wait a minute.
Yeah.
And Robert Kennedy and all of them, because I was hurt that Caroline Kennedy attacked her cousin in that way. Because I said, wait a minute, there's a lot of pain here. There's a lot of pain. And let's acknowledge that. Let's acknowledge
Yeah.
that having
This didn't come from nowhere.
it
Yeah.
didn't
Yeah.
come from nowhere. And
Yeah.
I'm just knowing all of this now. And I know he has fought very hard to get these records released. I know
Mm-hmm.
that. And I know he's had some familial opposition, and only heaven knows who's talked to different family members, because that's how that works too.
Yeah.
I only have about 4 or 5 minutes left here. Who and what should we be listening to? Who and what should we? I mean, what should we?
Well,
be
you for what?
Oh no! Oh,
Seriously. Oh my gosh.
no!
There's a
Get
small
her book.
press called Mint
Uh,
Press News. If people
mhm,
want to read online, I say go there. I've read amazing articles from there and grayzone.news. Um, skip the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and
mhm.
the mainstream sources will usually not be good places to find the truth. And there's several podcasts that do a good job on this. One of my favorites happens to be one called That's Enough Out of You. It's one guy's done a lot of his own research. They talk about the mob and JFK, but not together, because he doesn't believe the mob killed JFK. He just has a serious long research interest in the mob that he's studied for years. But sometimes they talk about sports, but a lot of times they talk about the assassinations of the 60s, because Sean Kane, one of the hosts, is very much in favor of the files coming out, and he's done a ton of research over the years, so he's got a good sense. The guests he have on tend to be the ones closer to the truth, because like I said, there are a lot of good people in the research community who just go down these tangents that go nowhere or end up being proven false, a year later. And I've kind of distanced myself from the JFK research community for that reason, is there's very few researchers that I think ask the right questions, because
Ah,
a lot of people, when you hear something over and over for years, you assume it's true. And I had a friend recently say, oh, well, I heard this guy say it on a show and he has a huge audience. He wouldn't have lied to that many people. And I'm like, but they do. It's the big
boy.
lie technique is spectacularly successful. People will say what they believe to be true, and the bigger the audience, sometimes the bigger the lie. And that's how they get away with it. And Hitler wrote about that in Mein
Mhm.
Kampf, and he said people can't imagine telling everybody tells small lies, but most
Yeah.
people can't imagine telling really big, huge lies for fear that they would be so obvious. And so the people who do tell really big, huge lies often get away with it, because people say, well, if that were false, he wouldn't say it, because that's just a big lie. I remember when I was looking into this, Robert Kennedy assassination, and somebody suggested to me that the police had switched the bullets, which they did, by the way. But it took me a while to get there. When she first said that to me, I'm like, they wouldn't do that.
Oh,
I mean, that's incredible. They wouldn't switch the bullets. That's how naive I was.
oh
But
boy.
I followed her path through the files, and I found the markings on the bullets, and it was very clear that the police knew right from the start that Sirhan could not have fired the bullets that killed Kennedy. And so they dummied up a new set where at least three of them matched each other. And then in 1975, when a film basically forced a reinvestigation of the evidence, those three bullets matched, and all the headlines said a single shooter shot RFK because the bullets matched. But they did note in all those articles, by the way, they couldn't match those bullets to Sirhan's gun. And the story behind that, go read my book.
Well, it's a lie too big to fail. The real history of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. After you read this book, it will help give you clarity on JFK's assassination and a lot of the unanswered questions around it. Martin Luther King's assassination and a lot of the unanswered questions around it. Look at the people who were around who were smeared.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was something I've seen various people talk about with respect to Dr. King's assassination, because they said that my father was smeared in that because he, as the youngest guy in the group and as someone who was tremendously charismatic, who also had his own following, that's why Dr. King hired
He
him.
had power, right? So
They
had to
they
take
said
him
no,
down.
we've got to smear him at least.
Mm-hmm.
We deserve to know the truth, and look at who's protected and look at who's exposed or who's smeared. I want you to get the book, A Lie Too Big to Fail, and call her publisher and say, release the paperback. I,
Well,
release
it
it's
will come out. It will come out. It's just going to be summer. Yeah.
well, we want it, and it's A Lie Too Big to Fail, the real history of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. It is a tremendous, tremendous read. I learned so much, and I'm on my third reading of it because I needed.
Oh, thank you.
Well, no, and I thank you.
But it takes a few times through. I mean, I
I
have
mean,
often read books more than once because there's so much in there.
yeah, well, no, this particularly had so much in there that I needed to read it over and over and over because I felt that there was a lot to learn. And may God bless you and keep
Mm.
you. And I can't wait to
And
have you back
you.
to the show.
We'll do that. You're one of my favorites. Thank you so much,
Oh,
Santita. I just love you.
I love you. You are my sister beloved. Lisa Pease, everybody. A Lie Too Big to Fail. Get the book. Get the book. I'm sending you so much love. Everybody have a great, great, great one. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. God bless.